to the cloud. Okay, great. And I'm gonna open the doors. There we go. Hopefully people will come in. Maybe not. Hi, Jeff.
Hey, Jeff.
Hi, KP. Oh, people are coming in. Hello, friends. Okay, we have a small and mighty crew of attendees today. I'm just going to jump in and get started because we do have, it's like, we have an hour and a half. Hopefully we won't take the whole thing, but I know people, we appreciate the fact that people are taking the time to be here. So let's jump in. Hello, welcome. Today marks the first of two of our Shotgun Day replay webinars at SIGGRAPH in LA just a month or two ago. We had a whole day of programming around what Shotgun is and all the cool things that you can do with it. There were two of those sessions that were a little more technical, that were in the vein of the Shotgun Developer Day that we had last year in Vancouver at SIGGRAPH. And this year we are representing that information as webinars and recording it so that people who weren't there can have access to all of that good stuff. Today is the first one. Next week at this same time, Thursday at 10 a.m. Eastern will be, I'm sorry, 10 a.m. Pacific, that was weird, will be the second one. And the one today is an intro to development, but the one next week is slightly more advanced development. We will talk about all the different ways today that you can develop with Shotgun and interact with Shotgun programmatically. I'll be doing that. And then following that, Patrick Boucher, who you can also see on the camera right now, will be diving a little deeper into specifically our REST API and our APIs in general, and demonstrating how you can do cool stuff with that. So again, thanks for being here. I know that people are busy. We appreciate that you're taking the time. I have a weird technical thing where I'm going to be looking at my presenter notes on my phone while I show you guys my slideshow, just because it didn't work the way I wanted it to. So bear with me. I think it'll be okay. But let me get this up and then I'll share my screen and we will jump in. There's this. Are you guys seeing a full screen presentation right now?
Absolutely, you're good to go.
Great. All right, great. So I will jump in. I didn't really introduce myself. My name is Tannaz. If you've been to these webinars before, you know me, but I'll do a bit of an intro. I talked a little bit about what we're going to be doing today, which is talking about what you can do with Shotgun programmatically, the kinds of development that you can do, which is a lot. So over the course of these two webinars, there's going to be a lot of deep dives. We're going to throw a lot of information at you. I intend to sort of ease you in gently in this first part. So before I do, I'll mention that we have a GitHub repo that contains these slide decks from today and next week as PDFs, as well as any of the code examples that we are using in these presentations are also in that repo. So if you want to get at that material, it's there for you. Okay, so me. My name is Tannaz. As I mentioned, I've been in this industry for a lot of years now. I started out as a pipeline TD at Rhythm & Hughes Studios for a few years, and then I was a pipeline TD in a variety of departments at DreamWorks Animation for about 9 years. I started at Shotgun in 2016. I am a member of the mighty Streets team. We are the client-facing team here at Shotgun. And specifically within that team, I'm part of the technical support or street engineering team, and specialize in Toolkit, which is of course our pipeline offering. So that's me. As I mentioned, as we go through the series of courses today and next week, we're going to take a detailed look at all of the different ways that you can write code for Shotgun. But to start, I wanted to introduce you to a few real world oops, sorry, I'm trying to get at the chat and I'm instead advancing my Oh, I can't even see it. Hold on. I apologize. I'm having some serious technical difficulties. Let me.
Don't worry about it, Tannaz. I'll keep an eye on the chat, and I just
Okay,
posted.
thanks.
If you guys have any questions at any point, feel free to drop them into the chat, and we'll get to them in our QA portions.
Thank you. I lose the mouse pointer when I'm in full screen. It's telling me that sharing is paused. Hold on. Why? One sec.
Uh,
Let me try again. Okay, are we
yep.
good? Do you see my screen?
Yeah.
Great. Sorry, it's telling me that sharing is paused. Bring my shared window to the front. Are you seeing the screen advance?
Yep. Yep.
Oh, okay, so
It's not
to the next.
advancing. You're on your what we will learn slide, but we can see
Yeah,
the slide.
something is messed up here. One sec. Sorry, I apologize. I don't know what's going on. I'm stopping the share. I'm going to do this. I'm just going to share my whole screen. That should be fine. And then let's do this. Okay, now we're good. Okay, great. Sorry about that.
Yep.
Okay, so as we were saying, as we go through these courses, we're going to go through a detailed look at all the different ways that you can write code for shotgun. To start, I wanted to introduce you to some sort of real world scenarios that actually are not real world. They're made up, but they could be like in production scenarios of when this stuff is actually useful. Over the course of the talk, we'll learn about action menu items, webhooks, toolkit hooks, and APIs. But first, a little bit of background. To start on the same page, and in case some of you don't know, what even is this shotgun business that we're talking about? Shotgun is a review and production tracking tool set for visual effects, animation, games teams. It acts as a hub to centralize project data and gives you tools to unleash the power of that data. I'll mention quickly that we start kind of with VFX animation in games, but there are a lot of creative industries. Basically anywhere that there's a creative team working, shotgun can be useful. We've seen design, animation, manufacturing, architecture, all sorts of good stuff. So at the base of shotgun is a web app that's backed by a Postgres database. The web app gives studios a powerful cloud-based sort of source of truth, a single source of truth for all the minute details of tracking a project. From casting, tracking progress, managing assets, you can find everything in the web app. So we started with this web app, but quickly studios figured out that like they could do so much more with this shotgun data. Now that they have it, why not use it to say, drive file naming or directory structure for production files? Why not track artist publishes back in shotgun? So out of those desires came the pipeline toolkit, plugin integrations within artist tools that extend the shotgun experience into the artist workflow and give you the foundation for a basic publish pipeline. With Toolkit, an animator can automatically save their Maya file, for example, their scene file to the right place via the Work Files app without having to think about, oh, is it this folder? Is it uppercase? Is it underscore? Is it dash? Like all of that goes away. Additionally, like say if a character rigger is ready to share the latest version of a rig with the rest of the team, they can publish it using the Publisher app. It'll be tracked in shotgun, it'll be versioned, and then downstream artists can pick it up within their own work sessions via the Toolkit Loader app. And you can see some of those apps and what they look like here as they pop up at you. On the right in the background is the Shotgun panel, which is an app that kind of gives you a window into the data that's important to you as an artist from Shotgun within your work session. So you don't have to like, shift into the browser and then back in. It's all there for you. On the left is the publisher where you, as I said, can like publish your work and make it available to your fellow artists on your team. And then in the foreground is the loader where those fellow artists can pick up what you have published and bring it into their session so you guys can work dependently. So Toolkit was a significant extension of shotgun usage, but as we've experienced, no studio works the same way. Pipelines are not one size fits all. So even with all of those rich customizations that you get from Shotgun and Toolkit, or from the web app rather, and Toolkit, sometimes you need to go even further with extending your functionality, which brings us to the APIs. The various check-in APIs give you the power to use out-of-the-box products as a starting point and then customize, to your heart's content. You can automate repeatable tasks, build triggers, integrate check-in into your studio's existing tools, and more. So we're going to dive deep into each of those. So now let's go through these scenarios and see how we can solve these real-world studio problems and build better pipelines. So our first scenario is Nadia. Nadia is a production manager at a visual effects vendor studio. In case you're not familiar with that idea of a VFX vendor studio, let me explain a little bit. Basically, the idea is that, like, say you're a film production company, a film production studio that is producing a film that requires some visual effects work. There's some explosions, there's some clouds, there's some water, or whatever. And you don't have the resources in-house to do that work. You hire a visual effects studio to basically do that work, do the effects work. They will render it, they will composite it into the live action frames that you have provided and deliver that back to you. So in that relationship, the film production studio is the client, the VFX studio is the vendor. So our Nadia is a production manager at a VFX vendor studio. Her show has some shots that are in production, they're rolling along, and they're ready to begin delivering things back to their client. The client has asked to see renders in QuickTime format in addition to the EXR file sequences that her artists are rendering. They have very specific naming conventions, and she wants to keep everything organized on disk in per shot folders. So for her, she's noticed that this process is really tedious. It's manual, it's time consuming for her coordinators. So she wants to provide them with an automated way to do it right from check-in. So enter action menu items. With action menu items, or AMIs, you can add custom scripts to right-click menus on entities within the check-in web app, allowing users to run arbitrary code from context menus right within check-in. So Nadia had her pipeline TD set up an AMI so that when you right-click on a shot entity in check-in, you'll have a prep for client delivery menu item. When you choose it, the final EXR sequence for the shot will be converted to QuickTime. It'll copy and rename both the EXRs and the QuickTime to match the client's naming convention, and it'll place all of these copies in a per shot folder within a designated client outbox. I'll mention before we move on from Nadia that in the second half of this session, Patrick is going to be demoing an AMI that takes advantage of our REST API to automate client deliveries. It's not exactly like this, but it's actually quite close. So there's a lot of uses for AMIs. You might use them for like an upvote or like system, especially if you're tracking, say, feature requests or other kinds of tickets in check-in. You could use this for people to demonstrate that a certain request is important to them. You could generate thumbnail PDFs, for example, from a selection within Pipeline. You can archive old assets using AMIs, whatever, the sky's the limit. So Nadia is all set with her AMI. Let's continue with Violet. Violet is a layout supervisor on an animated feature. Her artists are rapidly going through shots, and currently she is a PA that's spending time going through individually and switching the status on the animation task on each shot to ready to start every time that the layout task is set to final. She wants that process to be automated, but in this case, AMIs would kind of defeat the purpose. If you're going to use a right-click menu item to change the status on a task, you might as well just directly change the status on the task, right? In her mind, it should just happen automatically whenever a layout task is finalized. So for her, we have webhooks. Webhooks allow a notification to be sent anytime that an event that you have subscribed to takes place on your site. That notification goes in the form of an HTTP request that is sent to an endpoint that you define with a payload of information about the event. You can then create custom code that uses this payload to do whatever cool stuff it is that you want to do either back in your check-in site or elsewhere. I'll mention quickly, this isn't necessarily her solution, but with webhooks, you can also rather than sending to your own servers, you can send that HTTP payload to existing services on the web like Zapier or IFT, which is short for if this then that. And these services integrate further with other services like you know, like Google Docs or like Slack or Salesforce or other email clients or whatever it may be. So with minimal code, you can actually build really powerful integrations with a lot of services on the web via webhooks. So having said that, back to Violet. So in her case, her TD can create a webhook that will run any time that the layout task is set to final on a shot, and use that payload to run a script that'll automatically set the status on the corresponding animation task to ready to start. I'll mention here that in the next session next week, Brandon Ashworth will be demoing exactly this. He'll use webhooks to implement like a status flipper that's more general than just these two tasks. It can be across the pipeline. So you'll see anyway how you could set this up in detail. You can do a lot of things with webhooks. You can notify artists if a shot goes on hold or if it's out of picture. You can add versions to smart playlists at the time when they're created. You could create a daily playlist for the team to see their colleagues' latest work. That's actually a really fun thing that I've seen, where like, you know, you can go in the morning and see all of the things that your team has been working on, the things that they have put out since the last day. It's really cool. You can assign artists to a project when they're assigned to a task on the project. In general, webhooks, oh, actually, before I go, oops, sorry. We have to go through all these animations again, apologies. And they're slow. The general idea here is that webhooks allow you to connect your shotgun data to other websites. Any service, internal or external, that accepts a webhook payload can be connected. Okay, now I'll mention, while we're talking a lot about webhooks at SIGGRAPH and today, we actually already had a framework that allows you to trigger logic based on events that take place in your shotgun site. Webhooks is the more modern standard solution that gives you that ability to integrate with other online tools. But there are still some places where our local event daemon is the way for your studio to go. If you don't have internet access, if you prefer not to expose incoming connections to your studio, or if you're concerned about exposing a tool that can access your production file system to other internet sites, then the event daemon framework is the way for you to go. So if you're interested in participating in the beta, you saw in the corner that this isn't released yet, but we are doing a beta. Just contact us here. I think we're getting that going in the next week or two, and we'll be in contact back with you. Okay, so Violet is all set with her webhook. Let's talk about Jed. Jed is a crowds lead. The animation team on his show is using Toolkit Publisher to publish animation as Alembic caches, not uncommon. But he wants his crowds artists to be able to pull animations work into their massive sessions, which requires that the geometry be in the FBX file format. He wants those FBX files of the animation to be readily available without artists having to take time to generate them at the time that they need them. So in this case, we're going to use toolkit hooks. Our toolkit apps that we talked about in the beginning have been designed with hooks. They're bits of the logic that have been separated from the main code base so that they can easily be overridden and extended. The idea here is kind of twofold. On one hand, you want a simple file so you don't have to like go through all of the logic of the entire app just to make a small modification. And also, you can maintain modifications that you've made when they are in hooks and still get updates from us on the app itself. It's a nice way to get the best of both worlds. We have hooks for a lot of our apps, some engines, and there are even core hooks where you can customize the core functionality of Toolkit in certain places. Specifically, in his case, we have the Publisher app, which is probably the most sophisticated set of hooks. It's actually a plugin architecture where you can define what happens at publish time in great detail for all the different kinds of things that you might want to publish. So for Jed, he might have his TD modify the publish plugin for animation so that it generates FBX files from their Alembic caches whenever they run a new publish. He just takes over the existing publish plugin hooks or writes his own and they'll be ready to go. So there are a lot of other uses for toolkit hooks. File conversion we talked about, but that could also include in-house formats to more standard ones if that's something that you guys, if that's a requirement in a given studio. You can add needed command line arguments or set environment variables when you're launching software. The idea there is that when you're using the Shotgun's pipeline toolkit, you use our launchers to launch, artists use our launchers to launch Maya, Nuke, Houdini, Photoshop, etc., Unreal, After Effects, whatever it may be, in a Shotgun aware way so that it knows who you are, what shot you're working on, what task you're working on, etc. So you can use hooks to, if you guys have kind of special sauce that goes on at lunchtime in your studio, you can inject that into our processes using toolkit hooks. You can add actions to the Shotgun panel. Again, it's kind of a right-click menu, but inside of the artist's work area, say, for example, to like generate a reference image plane so that, say, an animator can bring in reference images directly into their Maya session. Okay, so that is Jed. He is all set. Finally, let's talk about Lily. Lily is a pipeline TD, our hero, right? She works at a large studio with lots of custom code, lots of established user experiences, a lot of existing pipeline, right? So for her, the challenge is getting her studio's in-house tools to access and modify her Shotgun data, and writing apps that fit into her existing pipeline, but which use Shotgun data. So for Lily, as I said, we have a small handful of APIs, as well as tools to get her started on custom app development. To demonstrate our APIs, we have this amazing imagery that Mason Jarrett, one of my fellow street team members, has drawn up for us, which is so awesome. So we can just like start at the top and go down. We start with a simple Python-based API for accessing Shotgun and integrating with other tools. There's CRUD methods that give you raw access to data going in and out of Shotgun. You can add things, you can delete things, you can query, you can update, and so on. Last year, we released a REST API. It has functional parity with the Python API, but it gives you full data access for cases when Python isn't the right choice. For example, if you want to write something in JavaScript or C++ or whatever language it may be. As I mentioned, in the second half of the session, Patrick will be demoing REST API. On top of that, the Toolkit platform has its own API, and that allows pipeline TDs to quickly build configurable tools that can run across applications. Since Lily needs to write some custom apps, we offer her a couple helpful starting points. We have a starter app which gives you basically like a blank UI framework that you can start building upon. And then what you're seeing here, which is the demo app. It includes examples of common UI elements, as well as the underlying code for each one. It's really lovely. Pretty cool tool there. So with all of these scenarios, the big takeaway is that like having these touch points, Shotgun can give one TD the power of many TDs. With AMIs, webhooks, toolkit hooks, we've laid the groundwork for you so that very quickly you can extend and integrate your Shotgun workflows, both for production management and for artists, without ever having to start from scratch. And even when you are starting from scratch, you have these rich intuitive APIs to get you going. And actually, you're not even really starting from scratch because you have the starter app and the demo app to help you take your first steps. That's what I have today. Before I open it up to questions, I wanted to, we have a whole bunch of QR codes, mention a few things. If you are new to Shotgun and want to check it out, you can use the first one to look at starting a Shotgun eval. You'll have 30 days to kind of do a fun test drive. Our roadmap, as far as what we're planning for the future, is now public. If you want to know what we're planning on tackling next, that's where you should go. And I'll mention with great excitement and enthusiasm that as of SIGGRAPH, we launched community forums that have been awesome so far. It's community.shotgunsoftware.com. The people that are in there are a mix of members of the Shotgun team from all different departments, from product to street to engineering, which has been lovely, as well as users of Shotgun out in the wild who both have questions and have a lot of insight on on the ways that you can use Shotgun in Studio. So I encourage you, with a lot of, I don't know, a lot of push behind it, to go check out the forums. They're awesome. And that is all I have. Do we have any questions? I'm going to stop my share so that I can see what is even going on. It doesn't look like we have any questions yet, but I encourage you to put any in if you have any.
Yeah. Anybody can use either the chat panel or the Zoom Q&A function to drop in questions as the talk progresses. We're going to be here to either just answer in line or cover them when we get to the end of our sections.
All right. So with that, I will hand it off to Patrick to take over the second half. All yours, Patrick.
Cool, cool. Thank you so much, Tannaz, for setting this up and getting us started here. We just choose the right desktop to share. There we go. And nice. So you should be seeing a full screen presentation right now.
Yep.
All right, excellent. So again, thanks everyone for joining us today. In this part of the talk, we're going to be discussing the various data management techniques and APIs that Shotgun has available. We're going to be concentrating on mainly the Python API and the REST API. All things that Tannaz so brilliantly covered in the first part of this webinar. So a little bit about me. My name's Patrick. I'm a street team member here with the technical support staff. Studied animation. Was a pipeline TD for about 13 years in various facilities. And joined Shotgun in about 2012, about 7 years ago. My most recent role is that of technical support engineer on the street team. So I've probably interacted with some of you at one point or another on a ticket. Because you've always wanted to take a picture of your computer screen, I'm sure this is your opportunity. This is a link to the GitHub repository that we set up at SIGGRAPH when we first did these presentations. So if you want to get the materials that are covered in today's webinar, as well as next week's advanced topics webinar, this is the URL to go to. When people are new to programming with Shotgun, they often wonder how and where to get started. Well, you're here, so you've already taken the best first step you could take. Actually, where I like to suggest people start is usually with the Python API. The Python API is definitely some of what we're going to be looking at, but we're also, like I said, we're going to cover other topics, general Shotgun tips and tricks. A bit more specifically, here's what I'm hoping your main takeaways are going to be. We're going to be looking at how to set up a script entity in Shotgun and connect to Shotgun via the Python API. We're going to be looking at querying, creating, and updating data in Shotgun. We're going to be looking at what entity dictionaries and there's a special name key in those entity dictionaries that we're going to be looking at. We're also going to look at something called linked field syntax, or you might see some street people refer to it as being bubbled field syntax as well. We're going to be looking at uploading via the Python API. And we're going to be looking at how AMIs, action menu items, as Tannaz explained. We're going to be looking at how AMIs work, how to set them up, and how to use Flask to write a simple AMI. In this portion, we're also going to be looking at the REST API. This is Beaker from the Muppets. If at any point you feel like this picture of Beaker is you, that things are going too quickly or getting out of hand, remember that all the Friendly Shotgun staff is here to help you. You can reach them. You can reach the street team via many ways. Our email alias, support@shotgunsoftware.com. We're here to answer your questions and maybe even give you a virtual hug if you need one. Also, like Tannaz, I cannot recommend you going to our forums, community.shotgunsoftware.com enough. That we launched at SIGGRAPH. It's already becoming a super vibrant place with users interacting with engineering, with support people. Great place to go if you want some answers, if you want to even talk about various techniques, what to do in different studios. Alternatively, if you get bored and feel like this is you, don't worry. Brandon and Mane will be presenting advanced development topics in a second webinar, same time next week. So you've got more than enough time to start looking like Beaker. All right, for the sake of argument, let's imagine a scenario where you're using Shotgun for your review process. Usually version submission starts out with users uploading content manually via drag and drop in the web app. This can be pretty time consuming, especially if you have, say, 100 versions to submit. This is where the API can come in handy, as you can write tools to automate the review submission process. The tool that we're going to write isn't going to be a complex one. We're going to keep it to its simplest form possible. Once the tool runs, here's what we're going to be left with. We're going to be left with a version with a clip uploaded to it. For this to work, we're going to need to connect to Shotgun, fetch the project and shot that our version is going to be linked to. We're going to need to create that version, and finally upload the movie. Let's look at some requirements that you're going to need to make this work. Obviously, a key requirement for the Python API will be Python itself. Goes without saying. If you're on Windows, you can opt for Active Python, which will come with PyWin32 and a bunch of other goodies. If you're using the REST API, any language with an HTTP or REST library will do. For this case, for Python users, I'd like to recommend the requests library. All right. As for the Python API itself from Shotgun, which is obviously something that you're going to need as well, you can get it via developer.shotgunsoftware.com. Or you can go directly to developer.shotgunsoftware.com/Python API, which is the URL you have in that pretty little screenshot. And it'll get you directly to the Python API docs where you have install instructions. Alternatively, if you're a GitHub fan, you can also go directly to GitHub where you can grab the latest tag of the Python API. It's really easy to download and install. All right. Finally, and now we're getting into the meat of it a little bit more. To get your script to work, you will need what is called a script name and a script key. There are many ways to authenticate using the Python API, but this is the simplest one and the one that we're going to be looking at here. To create your script key, you'll press the user menu icon on the top right of the Shotgun UI, and you're going to select scripts. You need to be an administrator to do this, by the way. In the scripts page, you can generate a new script, give it a name, and jot down in a secure location the application key. You probably noticed in the screenshot that there are multiple script keys. Why do we have multiple script keys? Well, having more than one key, and preferably one key per tool or script, will allow you better control over your tools and better auditing of which tool performed which change in Shotgun. As your pipeline grows, troubleshooting it will be much easier if you have this multiple key setup instead of just one. On the support team, we see a lot of clients that create wrappers around the Shotgun Python API. This isn't a bad practice by any means. However, including your authentication in the wrapper, I'd argue, is a bad practice. If you wrap the API, make sure that you provide a mechanism for each tool to supply their own credentials, and that you don't bundle all of the tools under a single set of authentication credentials that live inside the wrapper. Okay, let's start our tool and go fetch some data with the Python API. This is the first part of our tool where we connect to Shotgun and go retrieve data. First off, in our imports, we'll import the Shotgun API so that we can create a connection. The second block of our code stores our script name and script key information that we created in Shotgun, along with our site's URL. You should not store this information directly in your script because that would be pretty insecure. Preferably use something like environment variables or other even more secure techniques. Next, we are going to create a connection to our Shotgun site's URL and authenticate using the script name and script key, which were created in Shotgun and stored out of our environment a few lines above. If you use script key-based authentication, like we're doing right now, please remember that you can tweak your script's permissions via the admin options in the user menu. This will allow you to control which script key can access which entity types and which fields in Shotgun. And then you can provide the appropriate key to the developers, with each key having their own access restrictions. You can also authenticate with a normal user's username and password, with or without two-factor authentication, with a session token, and a bunch of other options. But I'll let you read the documentation for those. Finally, we're getting to the fun part here. We're going to read some data from Shotgun. On this line, we use the find one method to fetch a single project whose name is Hyperspace Madness. The second argument of the method, it's known as the filter. It's a list of conditions that define which projects we're looking for. Here we're looking at an example of a pretty basic filter. Each condition in the list has 3 parts. So each condition in our filter has 3 parts. The first part is the field that we're filtering on. The second part is the kind of filter, also referred to as being the relation. And the last part of the condition is the value that we're looking for. All right, the last bit of code that we have on this screen uses the same pattern as the line above to find the shop to which we'll link our version. Notice that this time around, we have 2 conditions in our filter. By default, the filter operator is an AND operator, meaning that both conditions need to be true to find a given shop. This can be changed with an argument called filter operator so that all conditions are ORed together. You can even make complex filters with a mix of AND and OR operators between conditions That is also obviously covered in our Python API docs. All right, did you notice that in our filters first condition here, we're searching on a field called code? But for the project find, one line above, it was called name. Well, these field codes correspond to grid columns in the Shotgun UI, but may have different names for accessing them in the API versus the name that you'll see in the Shotgun UI. So here's our first set of Shotgun tips and tricks. Here are a few tips that will help you figure out what the field code is for a given grid column in the UI. So first off, first way to do this, in a grid in Shotgun, you can right-click on the column header, click then Configure Field, and in the Configure Field dialog, you'll see the column name for the UI that appears in the web app, and the field code you need to use in the Python API, right next to each other. The second way you can get to this information is in a grid in Shotgun again, click the column management button, which is all the way on the right side of the header. Click Configure Columns, and in the resulting dialog, you'll see the column name for the UI on the left side, and the field, as you hover on it, you'll see the field code you need to use in the API appear to the right. So that's pretty neat because you can just hover on various names and you'll see the field code appear on the right, and then you can glean field codes for multiple fields at once. Finally, third way you can do this is by clicking in the user menu and choosing fields. You can access the fields page, which lists all the fields on all the entities in Shotgun. You can then find the appropriate field and find the API field code for that given field. So 3 ways of figuring out what the API code is for your fields in the Shotgun UI. All right, let's keep going with our script. Now let's add code that will create our version. Our code as it stands, this is what you're looking at, and we're going to add a single line. This single line creates our version. You'll notice that the first argument to our create method is the entity type of the record we want to create, in this case, version. The second argument is a dictionary, which includes field codes and their respective values. Here's where we're actually reusing the project and shot entities we found previously in order to make sure that our version is linked to the right location in the database, linked to the right project, linked to the right shot. Next, we're going to add another line where we're going to update our version in order to set its status to in review, or REV, which is our status shortcode. Like the find and create method right above, you'll notice a pattern in the arguments, which include the entity type and a dictionary of field values. One extra bit of information that needs to be supplied to the update method is the actual ID of the entity that you're updating, you're editing. In this case, we're reusing the ID that was given to us as a result of the create call. Let's take a minute to look at that version variable a little bit more closely. So Shotgun records in the Python API are ordinary dictionaries. They have 2 mandatory keys, a type, which determines the entity type of the record you're looking at, and an ID, which is obviously a unique ID for that record. This is the simplest form of an entity dictionary. Because of the dictionary nature of this object, you see now how we can use the ID of a record we've already fetched or created in Shotgun in order to update it later. Now, I said this was the simplest form possible. In reality, our create call returned the following. When you create a record in Shotgun, you get an object back that includes all the fields you supplied in your creation. So in this case, not only do we have like the type and ID, but we also have the name of our version in the code field, as well as entity dictionaries that represent the shot and project in those respective fields. Let's take a second here to explore those shot and project hashes that were returned. These hashes represent values in entity fields of our version. Let's call these linked entities. They both have a name key, which makes sense for a project, but in the case of our shot, we might have expected the shot name to be in a field called code, because that's what we've seen in the UI. Just as a bit of a reminder, if you go to a shot record, you'll see a shot grid and use our little tricks from before. You'll see that the shot code field in the UI has a code name for when you're in the API. So what gives? Why is it name yet again? Why is it always name? Well, in the case of linked entities, this name is a third piece of standard information the API returns along with type and ID. We've generalized this as being the name of the entity so that you can reliably access this information, but it represents a human readable name for the records, whichever field really holds that information, like name for a project or code for a shot. They get abstracted into this name. Maybe this is blowing your mind. Maybe this sounds a little bit weird. Let's put it a little bit more simply. If the only thing you need from a linked entity is a human readable name for some UI of some sort, this mechanism actually avoids having to do extra fine calls for the linked entities and gives you those UI compatible names in a standardized manner for free. It doesn't necessarily mean there's a field called name on those records in Shotgun. This is just an abstraction. All right, let's finish up this tool, and we're gonna finish it up by uploading some media. This last line is, again, really, really simple. It's just a single line for the upload. Its format is fairly similar to the update call in that you need to supply the ID of the record you're uploading to, as well as the entity type. The last two arguments are the path to the file you want to upload, as well as the field on the entity you're going to be uploading to. And that is it. We've got our version record ready for approval. All right, maybe somebody that's pretty on the ball, eagle-eyed here, or anyone just still mildly paying attention at this point, might ask why there's the update call in the script to set the status to review. I mean, couldn't that have happened in the create call in the first place? Yes, absolutely. It could, but then I wouldn't have had an excuse to cover the update call, entity dictionaries, the name key on linked entities. So just an excuse to cover more material. All right, now that you've got versions for review, here is another scenario for you. You want to create a tool that will prep a delivery for a client. This tool will let you select multiple shots. It'll create one delivery per shot and will add the appropriate versions whose status were pending to the delivery. This is a perfect scenario to use an AMI. This could also be implemented as a client-side toolkit app. And if you want to know more about that, the other talk next week is going to be your go-to webinar, most definitely. And if you remember Tannaz's part of the talk a few minutes ago, part of the webinar a few minutes ago, this is exactly the tool that she was mentioning Nadia, the production manager, was wanting. All right, so at the end of this scenario, here is what you can expect. Once you click on your AMI circled there, the AMI is going to be accessible when you right-click on one or more shots. You can expect a small web server to process your request and create a set of delivery records that are going to be accessible in Shotgun. Each shot selected will have a delivery made for it, which will contain links to all versions with a pending status for that shot. This again is a very simple implementation of this kind of tool. It doesn't pretend to cover all possible usage scenarios or error cases. So take it as it is, an excuse for learning about Shotgun's APIs. All right, let's talk about requirements again. What are you going to need to make this scenario work? In this use case, we're going to be showing you how an AMI can interact with a web service that you've written and how that web service can interact in turn with Shotgun. To implement the web service part, I'm going to be using Flask, which is a light web framework for Python. It's installable like any other Python module and is freely available. You're also going to need the Python requests library because we're going to be writing our interactions with Shotgun by using the REST API. We're using the REST API, but we're still using Python as a language because some of the concepts from earlier will transfer over fairly easily. However, this being REST, you could use any language you want. All right. Little bit of a digression before we get into code. Let's look at Postman. So Postman is a tool for API development, which is accessible at getpostman.com. From our REST documentation in the setting up a development environment section, you'll find a Run in Postman button, which will load a collection of API calls in Postman. This collection will allow you to experiment and familiarize yourself with our REST API. It's a really, really powerful, really neat tool, which I highly recommend. Once in Postman, to connect to Shotgun, we need to set up an environment that has the site, login, and password to use. You can start by clicking on the gear icon in the upper right of Postman to manage environments. You'll add a new environment and keys for host, login, and password, and you'll fill out the values with the account you want to connect as. Select the environment you just created as the active environment at the end. Now that credentials are available via the environment, we'll use them to get an authentication token. The auth token will be used by the API to talk to your Shotgun site, or used by Postman to talk to your Shotgun site. To do this, you click on the ellipsis menu next to the collection that you now have in Postman due to that Run in Postman button you clicked earlier. And you'll go to the authorization tab of the collection dialog. and click on Get New Access Token. You should see a dialog that appears that looks like this, that displays the resulting token. You click on Use Token to start being able to use the API in Postman. These tokens are only good for a fixed period of time, as determined by a site preference. You'll have to repeat the above steps to refresh your token as required in Postman. Postman's built-in authorization systems don't support refreshing tokens currently. So you either have to do that manually, or we've built a Postman pre-request script to help with this. I'm not covering the pre-request script here, but you can check it out in the docs. Once all of this is done, you'll be able to test any one of our 17 request examples, as well as make your own requests. You'll be able to test requests before you code them into your scripts or applications, and it should make your development process a lot more interactive, a lot more iterative. You can get these requests nailed down before you go to code. All right, let's step back from Postman for a second here. Let's get back to our action menu item scenario. So again, our scenario is a tool that lets you select multiple shots, creates one delivery per shot, and adds the appropriate pending versions to that delivery. First off, we're going to set up the UI for this. To create your action menu item, as an administrator, you'll open up the user menu top right, and you're going to go click on action menu items. In the action menu items page, you'll add a new action menu item, and you'll populate it as follows. Because you're setting up your AMI, because we're setting up our AMI to work on shot entities, only in this context will the menu appear when you right-click. Additionally, we're making sure that the system will require you to actually have shots selected before you can even invoke the menu item. And finally, by enabling the modal overlay option, we're making sure the AMI's output is shown in a dialog box on the page where the user click the AMI instead of opening up a new page. So you're keeping the user inside the context of Shotgun. Last part, and probably the most important, is the URL. The URL is the location that the browser will send information to when the menu is clicked. This URL is a URL that you control. This is the web app that you're going to be writing. At a really high level, everything in this process, in this action menu item process, starts in Shotgun when you actually click the action menu item. Shotgun then sends a special payload via HTTP or HTTPS, or even a custom protocol at the URL that you asked. Your code then kicks in, does what it's supposed to do. In this case, our Flask server will compute a response. And that response computing probably includes, with a high probability, includes communicating information back to Shotgun. In our case, this communication back to Shotgun will be the creation of the delivery entities. Here's an example of the data that you can expect Shotgun to send to your code in a slightly modified form of the Flask request object. I'd like to call your attention to some information which is really useful for custom report building, like the field codes of the columns that were visible on the grid, the human readable names of those columns, the sorting or grouping of those columns, so you can mimic if you're building a report, for example, you can mimic what was visible in the grid when the AMI was clicked. I'd also like to point out some information that is going to be particularly useful for general purpose tools like our own. The entity type of the grid you were on, so shots in our case, the IDs of the records that were selected at the time the AMI was clicked, and the ID of the project that you were in when the AMI was clicked. We're going to be like super interested in these. All right, on with the meaty bits and a little bit of code. This first bit of code in this scenario is for context. I wanted to show you the Flask code, even if this isn't by any means a course in Python web frameworks. I just wanted to make it obvious the minimal amount of non-API code that's required for this kind of integration. Here we're just importing our necessary Python modules, which includes the Shotgun API, obviously, as well as our requests library. We're setting up our connection and authentication information, pretty much the same code that you saw in our first scenario. We're also setting up a single route on our server that responds to GET and POST requests on our Flask server. And we're starting the server. I mean, all the real fun stuff happens in this method called process shots. And process shot is what we're going to be looking at next. All right, so process shots implements the high-level business logic of our action menu item. First, it authenticates and gets an authentication token using the REST API in getAuth header. This is kind of like what we were talking about doing in Postman earlier. First step is authenticating to then being able to call more methods in the REST API. We're going to break down these methods a little bit later. Then, using the information passed in through the AMI and the requests module, we loop through the IDs of each selected shot. For each shot ID, we will fetch the appropriate pending versions that we wish to deliver. And then now that we have the interesting versions, we can go ahead and create the delivery in the create delivery with versions function. Finally, obviously, we're going to tally the number of created deliveries, and we're going to report it back to our Flask server so that it can be displayed in our little UI. As you can see, the business logic doesn't need to be complicated for it to be usefully automating something, and for its automation to be a big time saver in your facility. All right, let's take a deeper look at the 3 key steps that we just outlined: authenticating with REST, searching for versions, and creating the delivery. First off, the authentication. To authenticate with a site using the REST API, you need to provide credentials to the access token API endpoint. Like the Python API, you can provide a script name and script key combination, or a username and password combination. What's important is that after you send these credentials, the API will return an authorization token, which you will send back on each subsequent request API command. You should keep in mind that this authorization token, like we talked about in the Postman digression, this authorization token will eventually expire. This is standard security measure. It's your responsibility to renew the auth token whenever appropriate for your application in order for you to always have a valid auth token. If you don't have a valid auth token, the REST API just won't respond to you. In our case, in this scenario, our AMI will be able to process our deliveries way before the token expires. So we're actually not even going to be worrying about renewing the auth token. The last part of our auth function sets up a header dictionary for future calls to the REST API. Notice the authorization header, which contains our access token as returned from the access token endpoint. This auth header will be reused by our version fetching and delivery creating code a little bit later on. After authenticating, our next step was to search for the appropriate versions for delivery. This is accomplished using the _search REST API endpoint. The search endpoint requires that we send it some search filters using the request body. This filter syntax should be somewhat familiar to you because it's extremely similar to the Python API filter syntax. There's one thing in here that I'd like to draw your attention to, which I've intentionally planted here. It's called linked field syntax, that entity.shot.id. When you're showing a column in a grid in the Shotgun UI, you go to the linked field section and you drill down through the hierarchy of entities and fields until you get to some deeply linked information. Well, that's the UI equivalent of linked field syntax. You start off by specifying a field on the entity type that you're searching for. In our case, this is the entity field on the version. Then you specify the entity type you're expecting back from that field. You then specify a field on that entity, and so on and so forth, until you get to the information that you're looking for. This is really an extremely powerful tool. In our case, somewhat reading things backward, we're searching for the ID of the shot that's present in the entity field of specific versions. What's the point of this? Well, using linked field syntax often reduces the number of searches required to get to data. This way, sometimes expensive combinations of calls can be merged into one, which is much more efficient. A bit of a digression, if you've noticed that the field names in the UI don't match the field codes in the linked field syntax, remember that field names and field codes can differ. All right, remember when I said that I planted this linked field syntax to draw your attention to it? Well, that's simply so we could actually talk about the concept of linked field syntax. Truth be told, this could have been written even more efficiently like this. Notice how we artificially construct an entity dictionary to represent the shot? Well, this is perfectly legitimate. You can manually build entity dictionaries like this and pass them on to the Shotgun Python API or the REST API methods, because that's just what they expect, just standard dictionaries. As long as you supply the prerequisite type key and ID key in the dictionary, you'll be fine. Searching for specific records in entity and multi-entity fields like this should be a reflex, as it's way more efficient than searching via linked field for an ID, or even worse, something like a text match on the linked entity when you already know the ID. If you already know the ID, just construct a dictionary and search on the field itself. All right, the last thing in the screen that I want to draw your attention to is the reuse of the access token headers in the headers that we build and then pass to the REST API call. All right, let's look at the REST API call that now creates our delivery, or the third step of this AMI. oddly similar pattern, right? So first, notice the access token headers being reused again. In this simple example, I'm just redoing similar work as before. In a more complex application, you'd probably refactor this a bit and extract some of this work in common functions like your header building and all that stuff. If we're going to create a record, we're going to need a data payload that describes the record, similar to the Python API yet again. The REST API simply expects a hash where each key is a field in Shotgun and each field's value is the value that should be in the database. These can be simple data types or Shotgun records for entity and multi-entity fields. You'll notice again that again, this is very reminiscent of Python API. We deliberately wanted the path to REST to be as simple as possible if you were already familiar with key Python API concepts. And finally, in this function, we're calling the entity endpoint with the proper entity type name in the URL and passing our new record information as document body, which will complete the REST call to create our delivery. Now, once all this back and forth between Shotgun, your AMI code, and back to Shotgun has happened, you're left with a list of deliveries that your production crew can use to track communications with the client. So I hope this scenario has helped you appreciate the usefulness of AMIs and the power and relative simplicity of the REST API. Remember, we use Python here, but the beauty of REST, just being standard HTTP calls, is that you can implement this in whatever language you choose, whether it have full REST or just HTTP libraries to further streamline things or not. You pretty much can use any language. All right, there are tons of things that we haven't covered here, like more advanced action menu item options, REST API methods or Python API methods that are more advanced, and not even to mention the Shotgun event daemon, webhooks, like in-depth look at webhooks or in-depth look at toolkit. So remember that next week there is the advanced topics webinar with Mane and Brandon that will be covering a lot of these topics like event daemon, webhooks, and in-depth toolkit. Here are more QR codes, so more opportunities to take pictures of your computer screen if that wasn't awkward enough. But this is stuff that Tannaz covered. If you want to start a Shotgun eval, that's the first one. You get 30 days to try out all this goodness. You can also take a look at where we're heading in the future by looking at our now public roadmap. That is the middle one. And to the right, again, most emphatically, I encourage you to hit community.shotgunsoftware.com, our forums that were launched at SIGGRAPH and are beginning to be very, very active with a strong community building there. And obviously, there's also all the Shotgun folk that are hanging out there, whether it be product, engineering, or the street team. We've all got your back if you go there. So that is me. And I will stop my screen share and see if we have any questions.
There was a question that came up while you were talking from Rob Thomas at Rooster Teeth, who's got a whole room full of people. And he said, can you speak briefly on best practices to safeguard against drop requests due to network outages, degraded performances, etc.? This came up in the first half of your talk, so can you address that one?
Cool, yeah, definitely. One of the things, if you're so inclined and you go see the Shotgun event daemon, by the way, hello to everybody in Austin, Texas. If you go look at the shotgun event daemon code, there is that kind of strategy for trying to avoid network outages and temporary blips and that kind of stuff, where if you add like an intermediate layer between the Python API and whatever work you're doing, you can essentially funnel your calls through a try loop, and maybe you loop like 5 times. And if there's a network blip, you'll catch that network blip, wait a little bit, and try to redo the exact same request. So from the like application side of things, you're still doing that one call, but then you have a buffer in the middle that just retries if there are network outages. And there's a little bit of that strategy going on in the shotgun event daemon code, which is, by the way, freely available and in a GitHub repo, github.com/shotgun/event daemon, I think, shotgun event daemon. So I am hoping that that answers your question. Rob Thompson, that's right. Okay. I think it covered the question. Sweet.
Oh, sorry, I was talking. I was totally muted. There are a bunch more questions in the chat. The first couple are about the webinars themselves. So yes, they'll be available to be viewed on YouTube. I will post in our Shotgun Dev Google group, as well as on the forums that we mentioned, that Patrick and I both mentioned in our talks, the URL to those once they're up. And the link to next week's URL is also in the forum. I'll see if I can find the forum post, and I'll post it in the chat once we've gone through these other questions. Are there best practices or documentation on how to pass the authentication script keys via environment variables?
I don't think that we have documentation, specific documentation on best practices there. Something that you find being done often is obviously the environment variable trick, but the environment variable trick it basically allows you to not write in clear text, because Python being an interpreted language, it's just a clear text file. So you're not writing in clear text your script name and script key. But that environment variable data has to be stored somewhere, has to be injected into your whatever process session that your code is going to be running into. And that part, we don't have best practices on. I think we should definitely take this question and bring it to our security team and probably write a doc for that. Obviously, there are a lot of specifics. Which operating system are you on? Are you on Windows? Are you on Mac or Linux? Which might change the approach, but maybe some broad outlines beyond the actual script side and more on the machine and infrastructure side could be interesting.
Cool. Next one. In sg.upload bit of the webinar, saw that Patrick placed a link to where the uploaded media rests. Is there a way that Shotgun can smartly populate that link without the developer having to keep track of every single path for a studio?
Let me see if I can bring up that specific slide. Sorry, I just want to make sure that I am referring to the same thing. So let me share this up real quick. So I think that we're referring to this upload line. Is that the case? Yes, that is the correct line. Thank you very much. Okay, so the path there At this very low level, we're saying upload to this version with this version ID, this path on the file system. And if I understand correctly, your question, is there a way to not have that path there and have Shotgun know where stuff is on the file system? At this extremely low level, no. You need to explicitly say where the file is on your file system, that such that the Python API can actually read the bytes from the drive and upload them to Shotgun. This being said, we do have something like Toolkit, which essentially builds over the Python API a bunch of tools and a bunch of frameworks and utilities that allow you to, like Tannaz was saying, publish and load stuff in your DCCs, but also better understand the structure of your file system, where you can define a schema, where things live, what their naming convention is, and so on and so forth. So by using that higher level framework, which is Toolkit, you can then more broadly specify, okay, this is this publish that was created by that user. What's the path to that? And please upload it. So by using that Toolkit layer, then yes, you can step away a little bit from your file system and not be as descriptive as this might seem. And yes, Toolkit, a high level, a broad strokes of Toolkit will be covered in next week's webinar. So definitely swing by there and check it out. The Toolkit docs are also kick-ass awesome. So taking a look at those will definitely give you an appreciation for what Toolkit can provide.
I'll put in a link to the docs. The developer docs in general, developer.shotgunsoftware.com. And also specifically the webinar tomorrow or next week, they'll be building a Toolkit app. So that's like the specific piece of Toolkit that will be covered there with some overview stuff as well. All right, anything else, guys? Any other questions before we call it a webinar? Doesn't look like it. Thanks to everyone for tuning in. As I said on that community link that I posted in the chat, actually, I didn't post the developer docs link to everyone, just so panelists. Let's do that quickly. And yeah, I'll post to that community link the URLs for the YouTube links once these recordings are up. And we also have, like, in our documentation, an index to all of our Toolkit webinars, and these are included there. So you can find it that way. Thank you. Again, I think this was really great. Hopefully we'll see you at the next one. Have a wonderful day or night or whatever it is where you are. Bye all.
Yeah.